All right, let's jump right in, folks. Today we're going deep on Saving the Erectus, the last hope for the masculine soul. This book, well, it's causing a stir, to say the least.
It's definitely a bold take on how modern society, well, how it kind of messes with men and their traditional roles.
No kidding. I mean, right off the bat, the author, Conrad Riker, is coming in hot. He's not holding back, not even a little.
He really lays into the whole idea of modern marriage, saying it's basically designed to put men at a disadvantage. Like, seriously, he doesn't pull any punches.
No, he really doesn't.
Mm.
I mean, he even goes as far as to say that divorce laws and custody arrangements are completely skewed in favor of women.
Yeah, and he doesn't just stop there. He brings up some pretty bleak stats about suicide rates among married men, claiming it's way higher compared to single guys.
That's a tough one to hear. It really makes you think.
And it kind of sets the stage for his whole argument. He's basically saying that men are trapped in this system where they're expected to be providers, but they're constantly at risk of losing everything.
It's a pretty bleak picture he's painting, that's for
Oh,
sure.
and then he throws in this whole thing about false rape accusations. You can tell it's something he's really passionate about, especially as a father with sons.
Yeah, he even throws out a statistic claiming that somewhere between 2% to 10% of rape accusations are actually false.
And he really hammers home the point that even one single false accusation can absolutely destroy a man's life.
Absolutely. And it also makes it harder for real victims to be believed. It's a sensitive issue for sure.
It is, and it's definitely one that raises a lot of questions, like how do we protect the vulnerable while also making sure the system is fair to everyone?
Tough question for sure.
Totally. But Riker seems to be suggesting that we've gone too far in one direction and that men are paying the price.
So then he takes this even further, right? He goes after this whole concept of gender as a social construct. Like he just straight up rejects it.
It's like he's drawing a line in the sand. He's
Yeah.
saying, look, there are biological differences between men and women, and we can't just ignore them.
Exactly. And he uses his background in evolutionary psychology to make his case. Pointing to things like the obvious differences in physical strength between men and women.
Yeah, he's saying that these differences are rooted in our biology and evolution, not just in how we're raised.
He even throws in some scientific studies about like differences in brain wiring and hormones.
Right, and he's not just talking about physical stuff either. He gets into how testosterone and estrogen play a role in shaping behavior.
Like he's saying that testosterone drives those classic masculine traits. Things like assertiveness and risk-taking.
Right, right. And that trying to force men to be less assertive or less competitive is basically going against their nature.
It's like he's saying, hey, this is how we're wired. And trying to change that is just setting men up for failure.
Exactly. And he sees this pressure to conform coming from everywhere, not just in relationships. Like, he even calls out the education system.
Yeah, he's pretty critical of how schools are handling, well, how they handle boys. He says they're trying to squash their natural energy and competitiveness instead of nurturing it.
Yeah, he uses this term, soy boy, to describe men who he thinks have lost touch with their masculinity. It's a loaded term for sure.
Yeah. But it really highlights this anxiety that some men feel about fitting in.
Yeah.
Like the world is changing and they're not sure where they belong anymore.
And he ties this back to his whole argument about societal pressure. He claims that this pressure to get married, combined with the financial risks of divorce, it's basically a no-win situation for a lot of guys.
He brings in some evolutionary psychology, too, suggesting that women are naturally inclined to, well, to marry up.
Yeah, and that just puts even more pressure on men to be the providers, to be successful.
He doesn't let the media off the hook either.
Yeah.
He picks apart some popular TV shows, like The Big Bang Theory and How I Met Your Mother, and he points out how the male characters are often portrayed as incompetent or kind of wimpy.
He even brings up the Ghostbusters reboot, the one with the all-female cast. He sees it as another example of how male roles are being erased or replaced.
Right, right. He's suggesting that there's an agenda in the media to undermine traditional masculinity.
It's like he's saying there's this war on boys happening on multiple fronts. It's in the legal system, the education system, the media, everywhere you look.
It's pretty intense stuff.
No kidding. And we haven't even gotten to his take on the gay agenda yet.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Hold on to your hats.
Ah.
So Riker's take on the gay agenda, it's pretty controversial, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, he basically claims that it's like actively trying to feminize men and erase traditional masculinity.
He argues that, with the mainstreaming of homosexuality, there are fewer strong male role models for young boys.
And he sees this as a direct threat to, well, to the traditional family structure.
Right. And he also suggests that it creates an environment where straight men feel, uncomfortable or like they don't belong.
It's definitely a hot button issue, no doubt about it.
It is. And it kind of highlights the sense of unease that some men feel about the shifting cultural landscape. Like the old rules don't apply anymore and they're not sure how to navigate it.
It's interesting, though, how he ties this back to his earlier points about the legal system and the media, right?
Oh, totally. He sees it all as connected. Like there's this bigger force at play that's trying to undermine men.
And he doesn't just stop there. He also takes aim at the education system, saying that it's actually set up to favor girls.
Yeah, he argues that, like the way classrooms are structured, the types of activities that are encouraged, it all plays to girls' strengths.
And the boys are kind of left behind, their natural energy and their competitiveness is seen as a problem instead of an asset.
Right, right. He's basically saying that boys are being punished for being boys.
And that this is creating a generation of men who are, well, they're less confident, less assertive, and less prepared to succeed in the world.
And then to make matters worse, he throws in this whole thing about the trans movement.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, controversial.
Totally. He sees the trans movement as a direct attack on traditional notions of gender.
He's worried that it's blurring the lines between male and female, and that this is causing a lot of confusion and anxiety, especially for men.
Yeah, and he specifically points to the media coverage of Caitlyn Jenner's transition. He contrasts that with the backlash against the trans movement as a whole.
It's like he's saying, look, society is celebrating the dismantling of traditional masculinity, but at the same time, it's punishing anyone who questions it.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. And it kind of brings us back to his whole point about the media's agenda, right? Like, he seems to believe that there's this concerted effort to push a certain narrative, and that narrative doesn't include traditional masculinity.
He sees it as a threat, something that needs to be, suppressed or even eradicated.
And this fear of losing traditional masculinity, it kind of spills over into his views on the decline of the nuclear family.
Right. He mourns the loss of the traditional family structure, with the father as the provider and the mother as the homemaker.
He blames feminism for this shift, saying that it's given women an escape from traditional roles, but that it's left men feeling lost and adrift.
Yeah, he argues that this has led to an increase in single motherhood and fatherless children, which he sees as detrimental to society as a whole.
And of course, he ties this back to his feminization argument, suggesting that as men have become less involved in raising children, women have stepped in and, well, they've feminized the upbringing of boys.
And then he goes even further, claiming that the feminization of medicine is another example of how men are being marginalized.
Yeah, he's pretty critical of the medical establishment. He says they're neglecting men's health issues and focusing too much on women's health.
He even brings up the birth control pill, claiming that it was intentionally created as a way to control men.
Like a population control weapon or something.
Right. It's a pretty out there theory, but it shows how deep his distrust runs.
He sees it as another example of how men are being manipulated and disempowered.
And all of this, the decline of the family, the feminization of medicine, the attacks on traditional masculinity, it's all contributing to what he calls the war on men.
And he believes that this war is having a devastating impact on men's mental health.
He points to rising rates of suicide, depression, and substance abuse among men as evidence.
He's basically saying that men are suffering in silence and that nobody's listening.
And that this silence is being enforced, by societal expectations that men should just man up and deal with their problems on their own.
It's a pretty bleak picture he's painting. But is it accurate? I mean, are men really under attack?
That's the question, isn't it? Riker certainly believes they are, and his book is a call to arms for men to fight back.
He wants men to reclaim their masculinity, to resist the forces that are trying to emasculate them, and to create a future where men can thrive again.
But how do they do that? What does that even look like?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve into Riker's proposed solutions and see if they hold up under scrutiny.
So Riker, he doesn't just leave us hanging with this whole, men are doomed narrative. He actually offers some solutions, some ways for men to fight back against this so-called war on men.
Right. He calls for like a masculine renaissance, almost like a reawakening of traditional male values.
Exactly. He wants men to reclaim their strength, their purpose, their their rightful place in society. But he's very clear that this isn't about, like, going back to the Stone Age or oppressing women.
No, no, he's not saying that at all. He's talking about a more uh, a more conscious evolution of masculinity, right?
Exactly. Like, he wants men to be more aware of the ways in which they might be, unknowingly contributing to their own emasculation.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. So what does that look like? Like, what are some of the concrete steps he suggests men take?
Well, for starters, he talks a lot about rejecting emasculation. He sees it as this constant threat that men need to be vigilant against.
So, like, men need to develop this inner strength to resist those pressures, to conform to a more uh, feminized ideal.
Exactly. He wants men to be more assertive, to stand up for what they believe in, to not be afraid to express their masculinity in healthy ways.
But what does that even mean, healthy ways? Like, how do you define that?
Well, he gives some pretty concrete examples. Like, he suggests that men be more mindful of the media they consume, the messages they're internalizing, even the language they use.
So it's about like a conscious reevaluation of how men see themselves in the world.
Exactly. And he also talks about the importance of men supporting each other, forming these brotherhoods where they can share their experiences and provide guidance.
I can see how that would be helpful. Like having a space where men can just be themselves without judgment or pressure to conform.
Exactly. And it ties into his broader argument about men embracing their traditional roles, especially as fathers and protectors.
Yeah, he really emphasizes the importance of fatherhood,
Yeah.
right? Like boys need strong male role models to guide them.
Right. And he sees the decline of fatherhood as contributing to a lot of the problems he sees in society.
He even connects it back to his whole feminization argument, suggesting that as men have become less involved in raising their kids, women have kind of stepped in and filled that void, which has led to, a more feminized upbringing for boys.
Yeah, and he thinks that's had a negative impact on men, on their sense of purpose and identity.
I know some people are going to push back on this whole idea of traditional roles, but I think it's important to remember that Riker isn't advocating for a return to some, like, rigid patriarchal past.
No, definitely not. He's talking about finding a balance, a way for men to embrace their masculinity in a way that's both authentic and respectful.
Right, right. It's not about dominance or control. It's about, like, integrating all the aspects of being a man. The strength and the sensitivity, the assertiveness and the compassion.
Exactly. It's about embracing the full spectrum of human qualities.
So it sounds like Riker's vision for the future of masculinity is a pretty complex one.
It definitely is. It's full of contradictions and challenges, but it's also a vision that's rooted in a deep concern for the well-being of men.
He wants to see men thrive, and he believes that this masculine renaissance is the key.
And whether or not you agree with all of his conclusions, his book definitely sparks a conversation about what it means to be a man in the 21st century.
It's a reminder that men are facing real challenges and that we need to find ways to support them as they navigate this increasingly complex world.
And if you're interested in exploring Riker's arguments in more detail, you can find his book, Saving the Erectus, The Last Hope for the Masculine Soul, on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
That's right. And be sure to check out our next episode where we'll be diving deep into another thought-provoking book. Thanks for listening.